first of all, to say thank you to Ellen and Lena and Milo for having me here today. It's been really insightful to listen to all these amazing presentations. So this paper is intended to introduce my initial PhD research questions, theories, methodologies, and some of the ideas that are emerging in my work. So the overall aim of the research is to investigate how the print artist can contribute to understanding changes in the landscape in the age of the Anthropocene. So my interest in this has emerged from my own practice as a printmaker and artist working in response to landscape. And within this presentation, I will discuss two key theories that have emerged as central to my project and how they may be taken up in my research inquiry. So the framework will be informed by the theory of slow violence as outlined by Rob Nixon in Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor. So the term slow violence refers to the environmental destruction that takes place over a gradual period, concealed, imperceptible, and devoid of immediate spectacle, commonly associated with notions of violence. Slow violence is often perceived as inevitable. It is too consistent to warrant the immediate scrutiny associated with disaster, presented by an image-centric media. And the notion of pluriverse, as outlined by Cadena and Blazer, is the proposal for recognizing the plural perspectives, heterogeneous practices, and diverse life forms that compose a world of many worlds. Pluriverse imagines and magnifies the multiple open-ended practices that coexist within an interconnected meshwork that allows for a multitude of worlds to emerge. So the methodology taken up in my research is one of qualitative data gathering. It's an action-led phenomenological approach that centers around specific case studies. And each case study is investigated through practice-based research in the form of artist residencies. So the framework of deep mapping, slow residencies, and fieldwork reimagined, as outlined by Modine and Biggs, is adopted to respond to the complex and elusive questions that emerge from slow violence through a corresponding practice of slow residency. And this approach refers to our relationship with time and the deliberate slowing down of the pace at which we interact with life. So the term deep mapping resists disciplinary definitions or academic boundaries. It concerns the quality of attention that is required to care for and respond to the landscapes we inhabited. Proposed as an embodied and reflexive immersion in a life that is lived and performed spatially. Robert describes deep mapping as a cartography of depth, a diving within. And within this research, fieldwork is adapted as a practice of anti-conclusion, where periods of immersion and reflection are applied as an attentive practice which answers to the qualities of the landscape it explores, shaping the Anthropocene. So John Law refers to a, quote, one world, a world which has granted itself the right to assimilate all other worlds, and by presenting itself as exclusive, cancels possibilities for what lies beyond its limits. So through anthropogenic practices that permeate our exploitation of resource-rich lands, we eradicate a world in which other life exists, beyond extracted wealth. Through expanding one world, we diminish another, tipping the scale of balance. We abandon an abundance of diversity that supports the majority in favor of a limited and exclusive wealth available to few. The eradication of such worlds raises questions within my own practice. What ghosts do absent worlds create, and what does it do to make them visible through artist practice? So we know that extraction and mining are key concerns within the debate around the Anthropocene. And my research actually began in the China clay pits in Cornwall. And the reason for this was actually from Cadena and Blazer's description of the destructive activities of extractivism. So they describe anthropogenic practices as the removal of mountains in a time-sufficient search for minerals. And I found this a really evocative image. That kind of violent betrayal of human shaping formed this visual anchor on how the Anthropocene might be imagined. So as part of my investigation, I visited several mines to try and get kind of grounded in this idea of human shaping. So waste material from the mining process forms mountain-like mounds scattered across the landscape. Locally referred to as the Cornish Alps, the white clay creates an impression of a snow-tipped alpine summit. The intention was to gather visual references and scope practical considerations, as well as anchoring into an embodied experience of shaped landscape. So situated in Blackpool mine, over a 3-day period, I gathered notes, visual references through photography and sketches, which would later be used to inform my process in printmaking. And the landscape really is full of dichotomies. It appears both picturesque and brutal. The hard edges of the steep quarry really contrast against these mounds of sandy matter that scatter the landscape. The China clay pits is also home to rare plant species. Gorse, lichen, and wildflowers surround this turquoise water of a synthetic lake, and man-made features of the mine imitate natural landmarks. The quarry stimulates cliffs, while the flooded pit of wastewater echoes the aesthetics of an alpine lake. Being an extractive process, photography easily excludes signs of human shaping through the limitations of the frame. So this encounter is grounded in an embodied experience. Dirt bike drivers use the slopes of soft earth as their playground. Their tracks impress the surface of the mound, scattering and shifting the loose soil. The mountains here continuously rearrange themselves. While the manifest traces of man are evident, non-human agents pick up the slack, continuing a lively rearrangement of matter. The wind carries and deposits grains of unstuck strata as part of an ongoing construction process that makes for a fluid geography. Attending to the process challenged the limitations of Anthropocene narratives, which often relate extracted landscapes to dead-end post-apocalyptic worlds. The embodied experience informed my perspectives on how landscapes are made and continuously unmade, an ongoing exchange of matter from which tension occurs. And insight emerges through this kind of loosening of the imagination to recognize that pluriverse unfolds when landscape opens towards a possibility that needs care. So reflections on that continuous movement and formation of landscape inform my approach on return to the studio. So working in lithography, I printed squares of cotton, folding the fabric with each turn of the press. Images of embossed tracks within the mine were fragmented through this process. The final image layered the dissected landscape. The traces of previous layers are partially concealed. The landscape shifts to form a historical pamphlemist, an ongoing making process where all narratives continually inscribe the present. Multiple landscapes emerge through reconstruction that depend on fold and perspective. Tests were also initiated in photopolymer etching. So I used Polaroid images and overexposed them to exaggerate the white mounds of clay, trying to create these ghostly impressions of something that's continuously forming and erasing. And further etchings were created through playing with fragmentation and the fluid rearrangement of the landscape. So this experience of the China clay pits and the printing process that followed was intended to question how the Anthropocene is made visible through extractive processes. The practice of fragmenting and erasing the images has instigated further reflections on making visible. Landscapes subjected to extractivism bear the physical impact of accelerated carving on the Earth's surface, indicating a visible trace of activity. Without the overt implication of a trace, such as witnessed in the China clay pits, how can slow violence be recognized? What strategies can be applied to interpret landscape affected by environmental change, but absent of such spectacle? These concerns would later inform my first case study in the Slieve Aughty Mountains. So while the China clay pits had really kind of created this visual imagery of extractivism and shaping, I was really curious about how slow violence might appear in landscapes where I guess it could be more concealed or maybe not as easily recognized. So the Slieve Aughty Mountains are located in the west of Ireland. And within the last 50 years, the state-owned commercial forestry company Cuilcha have engaged in substantial planting and harvesting of coniferous trees in the area. Due to the significant plantation practices and poor drainage of the bogland, water runoff has accelerated and contributed to the considerable flooding problems in the surrounding landscape. So flooding politics, commercial forestry, conservation practice, and local heritage overlap to create complex and often contradictory landscape. So these kind of landscapes don't really conform to the polarity of debates often associated with environmental change. Heterogeneous communities contribute to both the conservation and destruction of the area. Those engaged in practices that accelerate environmental issues, such as commercial forestry, may also form communities displaced by flooding. And this fieldwork of photographing and taking notes, sketches, it was also supplemented by family accounts of flooding politics, local heritage, and oral histories. And as part of my methodology, in situ notes and reflections are recorded as a resource to identify concerns and questions. So through fieldwork, further issues emerged which instigated questions and reflections on how slow violence operates within this landscape. Documenting an area of commercial forestry, the extensive problem of illegal dumping became apparent. Walking the forestry path, a stream pushes its way through a mangled car, eroding its metal body. Under the forest floor, bags of rubbish embed the earth, sometimes concealed by a thin covering of moss. I documented an array of electronics, furniture, cat food, and anonymous plastic parts. Noting the objects encountered, I would later write diaristic reflections as part of a methodology that contributes to a wider sense-making process. So, photographing the border of the forest, I noticed something reflected in a stream running through the undergrowth. Crawling under the low branches, I found 4 white legs emerging from the water. Unable to immediately identify the creature, I noted the position and features of the body as my eyes adjusted to the low light. Smooth white hair, unmarked, almost pink. Perhaps the lost fetus of a cow or deer. Its head lay submerged, only a pink tongue visible, lolling in the shallow stream. The dark water runs red from the peaty earth, denying any possibility of seeing clearly. So this is just a little excerpt from my reflections on fieldwork. And the calf likely originated from a local farm that it was probably dumped to avoid the cost of carcass disposal. But the incident facilitated reflection on how concealed or invisible narratives may be mapped as part of a wider assemblage of relations that contribute to slow violence. It also instigated questions on the relationship between dumping, forestry, and flooding. How might these issues be informing one another or pointing to a broader narrative? So, rotting corpse, invisible bacteria carried in the water, making their way back through river and stream to be consumed, invading, integrating bodies of those who discarded such creatures. Blood and fascia formed from spoiled water, an invisible line traced from body to land and back again. So these speculative observations exaggerate a cyclical narrative, but also function within a reflective process that magnifies and connects components of a wider narrative, the purpose of which imagines and creates intimate connections between slow violence and our bodies. This area, it's also host to archaeological ruins which further disintegrate alongside the rusting microwaves and fake leather furniture that are scattered along the forest. And I'm asking the question, are these indications of slow violence? the disposed body of the calf enabled a connection to form between past and present, indicating a changing landscape. This place, once the dwellings of an impoverished community, now inhabits the discarded excess of a capitalist society. So I also created initial test prints in intaglio and lithography with the intention to develop this mapping process. The images of the calf posed concerns about how slow violence would be negotiated within my practice without representing violence or spectacle. Working on photopolymer etchings, a certain degree of self-censorship emerged as I applied a layering technique with digital images of water to suppress the details of the calf's body. The intention was to create overlapping narratives that would conceal each other in their obscurity. So in order to carefully attend to the landscapes examined within this research, it is important to reframe the notion of fieldwork as reflecting ourselves as a component of the dynamic meshwork that exists across landscape, to recognize not only why we engage in fieldwork, but, quote, to what extent we are the fieldwork, unquote. In this recognition, a responsiveness can develop that corresponds to the complex, fluid, and unfolding environments we are part of. So the challenge within my creative practice is really to negotiate how these fragments give shape to slow violence. The attentive practice of fieldwork and deep mapping hopefully will allow me to develop an integrated methodology that responds to the specificity of landscape. Biggs and Modine state that we are the places we inhabit, we are not separate. Therefore, the trauma inflicted upon landscape extends to all those who inhabit it. Through a porosity that exists between experience and expression and representation. So in the context of my research, that might be understood as recognizing the interstice between fieldwork and studio practice, a pause between encounter and response. And while slow violence has a relationship to historical narratives, it cannot be confined to a past event. The traces it leaves are more accurately what Jill Bennett referred to as an indication of a lived present, a mode of inhabiting both place and memory. Thanks very much.